Hey, can you hear me okay? Okay, cool. Well, first of all, thank you for making this work. I know it's an early morning for you. All right, I'm just going to jump right in and establish that this is not a policy debate, so neither of us are proposing that the government take an action on a policy or law. It's about whether or not, in principle, we ought to have affirmative action. So this debate usually kind of comes down to whether or not it's fair for minorities to be admitted. But for the sake of this debate, I want to kind of focus the question on whether or not affirmative action works. Because if it doesn't do what it aims to do, then in principle, I think we ought not have it. So the existing problem in the United States is an education attainment gap between white Asian students and minority students that has been created by like a history of racism and discrimination. So now there aren't enough minorities in higher education proportionate to the population. So the ultimate goal of affirmative action is bridging that education gap for minorities. And we can measure that education attainment with graduation rates. So if a student doesn't graduate, then we can assume that they either didn't complete the program or they didn't master the subject matter. So I'm going to demonstrate that affirmative action is 1, ineffective, 2, counterproductive, and 3, draws attention away from effective solutions. So starting with where affirmative action has been ineffective with representation. So it attempts to boost minority admissions into universities so as to properly reflect the population. But a recent analysis of the effects of affirmative action that was published in the New York Times found that even with affirmative action, Blacks and Hispanics are more underrepresented now than they were 35 years ago. And this is true across Ivy Leagues, UCs, other top universities like MIT, USC, Stanford. So even though minorities are technically attending in higher numbers, the percentage relative to the population has actually dropped. So this means 2 things. 1, that affirmative action fails to meet one of the core goals that proponents emphatically advocate for, which is diversity. And then the number 2 is that the initial problem of not enough minority representation has actually gotten worse. So I'll get into later on more about graduation rates and being counterproductive and the effective solutions that we're kind of missing out on. But yeah, that'll be it for my first point.
All right, awesome. So just starting out, I'd like to outline what the essential thesis statement for the negative side is. And it is essentially that affirmative action should stay in place until the K through 12 educational system is improved and all students have equal access to good schooling. So well, my point is that not that affirmative action should stay in place forever or even that it's necessarily the best thing that we have available, but it is the best thing that we have available right now. And so what I'll be looking at is first the fact that, this educational gap, while it is big, it's most likely going to be solved in the future. So whether it's Republicans advocating for school vouchers or Democrats advocating for inner city school reformation, both sides are actively trying to make education opportunities for K through 12 better. And I think, everyone can agree to that. And so since both sides are committed to fixing this, regardless of how they are, it's reasonable to assume that within the next near future, 10 to 12 years possibly, that the opportunities for minorities will have improved. And by that point, we won't need affirmative action anymore. But until that time, we have to keep affirmative action in these universities because we have to give these minorities an equal opportunity to the education that they deserve. So the way we're looking at it, the way these minorities are accepted is they aren't necessarily given preferential treatment because of their color. They're treated as if they weren't able to showcase all of their talents essentially in high school. So you're looking at different people like immigrants and veterans, people who didn't really have a chance to showcase their full plethora of abilities in school, whether it's because, they weren't at home or they were in a bad situation, they were overseas, whatever it was, they weren't able to have that full experience and showcase what they want. We're also looking at people who have, unique talents, such as like oboe players or sculptors. People of that area, we're not looking at them such as, they're minorities, we have to let them in. We're looking at them because they don't necessarily have all the opportunities that non-minorities have, because I think across the board we can agree that minorities in general have worse schooling. They're generally around kids who have lower income type schooling, and so they're not getting the same opportunities that a white non-minority or white middle class person is getting. And so what this is doing is trying to bridge that gap, trying to get these kids into college, because they may not have as good of test scores as a lot of the non-minorities kids getting in. They may not have as good of grades, but their past and their schooling doesn't necessarily reflect their future. And we have to keep that in mind, and we have to give them an equal chance in this fight.
My time started. Okay, so all right, so I guess I want to start kind of. Okay, so in terms of the framing of the debate, I guess we can talk about whether or not it's the best thing we have right now. Again, I don't know if the timing of it, whether we ought to have it now versus whether we ought to have it later, is as important as the question of whether or not it's working. Let me start off where you talked about how it's supposed to bridge the gap by getting them into college. Because that kind of gets at my next point here, where it's counterproductive. Affirmative action has been counterproductive in terms of minority graduation. So if the goal of affirmative action is education attainment, not so much diversity for diversity's sake, though I'm not arguing that diversity isn't good in universities, but the point of affirmative action is, for them to eventually graduate. So nationwide, Black students graduate at a rate of 69%, Hispanics at 73%, while whites at 86%. So this education attainment gap has actually remained consistent for the past decade. So that shows that affirmative action isn't working. It's just not doing what it's supposed to do. So at that point, we ought not have it, even if and I completely agree that students, minority students, have worse schooling for a plethora of reasons. The solution hasn't been affirmative action, and we can see that just by the numbers. And then I guess if we're going to focus on, is it the best thing to have right now? Even if you did want to kind of focus on that question, if we look at California that passed Prop 209, that kind of proves that addressing the root cause of the problem, so the root cause of worse schooling, achieves the goal that affirmative action is trying to achieve. So affirmative action just kind of proves to be in the way of effective solutions, and we can see that the results of banning affirmative action in California has actually resulted in higher graduation rates for minorities. And let's see. Yeah, and this is precisely according to an interview with a UCLA professor of law, who's also really a big critic of affirmative action. This is precisely because it pushed UCs to address the academic preparation problem of minority students who now are boasting higher graduation rates than those admitted under affirmative action. So again, if we're looking at whether or not it works, it doesn't. So we ought not have it.
All right, so it's actually funny you brought up California, because I was actually going to bring them up in this speech, specifically looking at the year before that affirmative action ban was passed and the year 1998 when it was passed. So in the year 1997, one year before the ban of affirmative action, Hispanics made up about 14% of UC Berkeley's freshman class, which was about a 28% enrollment gap between those of college age and those who were in college. In 1998, after the ban was instituted, that 14% dropped down to 9%. And so while the number of Hispanics in California has grown, that acceptance rate has never gone over 12% after the ban. And then 13 years later, that gap is a 38-point differential. That's 10 points higher than it was in 1997. So you have 10% less, people going to college. You have less Hispanics applying to college. And the thing is, yes, we want them to graduate and have that success. But the fact of the matter is, some of these kids going to college aren't going to be prepared for it. That's just the fact of the matter because of their, their high school background. And, yes, we can measure, success and graduation rates, but we also have to realize that going to college just in and of itself is a success for a lot of these kids because, they may not get that opportunity ever. They don't have the money, they don't have the opportunity to go to a good college. They don't have the opportunity to go to any college, let alone, a good one. And what we have to realize is that, when we put that ban in place, when we remove affirmative action, minority students have a harder and harder time getting accepted into public research facilities. For example, University of Washington study found that there was a 23 point percentage drop in the chance of admission for minority students in states with bans, as opposed to a 1% drop in states that did not have that ban relative to non-minority students. So, I don't think you really brought up the fact there's discrimination against white people, but, there really isn't. And I'm not saying that you did, but just this whole idea that, these minorities are getting preferential treatment just is not true. And it's just, this whole idea that they are underrepresented, but it's the bigger issue of why are they underrepresented? Because, they don't have the proper educational systems. They don't have the methods that, a lot of people have to get ready for college, to prepare themselves. And while they may not have that, going into college, they may do worse in college. These are kids who want to go to college. These are kids who want to learn. They want to grow. And these are the type of kids that colleges want. Whether or not you get good grades is, besides the point. If these kids
Okay, so let me first address the enrollment rate conversation that you had. So yeah, it's absolutely true. Once affirmative action was banned in California, enrollment rates absolutely dropped, and that makes a lot of sense if they're not prepared and they're evaluated based on entering academic credentials. Then obviously the numbers are going to drop. But what we see is what's important. I think it's still very important to focus on the graduation rate because, again, affirmative action aims to close the education attainment gap. And if you look at the numbers since it was banned to now, the enrollment rate is steadily growing. So even though it's not back up to the same numbers as with affirmative action, it is steadily growing on its own, and the graduation, at the same time, that graduation rate is growing, which means that slowly but surely the initiatives to address the problem of worse schooling through in K through 12 is working because more students are prepared because we see the numbers kind of growing. So again, obviously, it would be ideal if those numbers were a lot higher, but there's a lot to fix in the system. So that is going to be gradual. Ultimately, that's still a better solution or a better kind of scenario, because if I understand that some of these minorities might never get accepted into college, and just getting in there is a huge accomplishment. But again, that's not the goal of affirmative action. It's not to create diversity for diversity's sake. It's to help students get an education, graduate, go on to work, the workforce, and succeed in the workforce. So I don't think that the argument that just getting them there and just diversity for diversity's sake is strong enough. Lyndon Johnson actually said, in regards to affirmative action, that you do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains, liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race, and then say you're free to compete with all others and still justly believe that you've been completely fair. So thus, it's not enough just to open up the gates of opportunity. And I think this perfectly applies to affirmative action as it is now, which is, yes, you can put them into college and offer them the opportunity, but obviously, if they're being held back by years and years of, disadvantages that they can't then overcome, then you're not really helping, and you're not solving the problem. And yeah, I'm not arguing at all that discrimination against white people or anything like that. So, yeah.
So, going back to the whole education attainment point, Graduation rates definitely are very, very important, and it's, pretty much one of the only ways we have to really gauge this educational standard. But the other thing we have to realize is that, just going to college in and of itself is, education, whether or not, you graduate. This is my first semester of college and I'm already learning stuff that, I never knew in high school, and, I haven't graduated. And even if I, dropped out of school tomorrow, I still would have gained knowledge, from this experience. And, the fact of the matter is, whether you go to college for a week, a year, or 4 years, you're still gaining experience. You're gaining knowledge of things that you had no experience with before. And the majority of, the minorities that affirmative action addresses, have that exact same experience. They've never been to college. They've never, lived, in dorm conditions. They never had this type of educational opportunity. And so, while, yes, that graduation rate may be up, you're still having less minorities going through the school system. And so, I'm not necessarily saying it's about diversity, but it's about getting them in the door. They need to at least have that opportunity and that chance to get their foot in the door, so then they have the opportunity to graduate. And we can't give them that opportunity if we're removing, the best way they have to get into college. And, right now, affirmative action is the best option. I'm not saying, it's ideal or it's perfect. It's definitely not. And there's many, many things, that could be changed to make it better. But the fact of the matter is, that's what we have at at the moment. And the status quo is, the best solution we have for those people right now. In the future, hopefully, if that K through 12 education system is fixed, then we can remove affirmative action and we can, just have a flat surface to, judge everyone. But until that time, we have to take into consideration that these kids, don't have the K through 12 background that a lot of non-minority students have, and that they don't have those same opportunities. They don't have the same opportunities to showcase themselves. They don't have debate clubs. They don't have, sporting clubs and different stuff like that. They don't have the opportunity to really, show colleges, what they have to offer. A minority student who has a 3.2 GPA may be just as smart as, a kid who has a 4.0. It just, it may be the difference, in teachers or tutoring, whatever that may be. When we let these kids get into college, it's better for the community and it's better for them as a whole.
Okay, so I'm just going to say that I think that to the extent that affirmative action is counterproductive to the main goal of education achievement, which I think has kind of been conceded in this debate, I think to that extent then getting them in the door and just getting them into college isn't enough for, answering that question, does it work, and should we have it? So we really shouldn't, if it's doing kind of more damage, or if it's working against the goal rather than towards it. So like you said, getting them in the door is enough, and that opportunity, that just being there is enough. But I think that kind of overlooks the fact that, first of all, there are many, many qualified minorities that do apply and do get in regardless of affirmative action because they're prepared. And so that's kind of the scenario that we should be aiming for. And this just doesn't really happen with affirmative action, because what happens with affirmative action is it distributes minority students at different patterns than those of their white counterparts. So this was studied, and what they found was that underrepresented minorities end up pretty much at the bottom, a lot of the time at the bottom of their classes, and this is just harmful for their education because most of them will drop out or not succeed, or definitely not graduate. Many of them will switch out of like STEM fields because if they're at the bottom of their class, they're more likely to switch out. So, and it's not that they're not qualified to be in college, but because of affirmative action, they were placed in a program that doesn't fit their individual needs, and so they're actually less likely to complete their education. So at that point, affirmative action is standing in the way of their education attainment. Let's see, and then So to the extent that it's in the way, not only of their education and the attainment, but in the way of finding effective solutions, which again, California was an example of this. This also happened in Michigan. The University of Michigan was one of the universities where there was a lot of controversy surrounding affirmative action. And we saw the same results when Michigan banned affirmative action there. The same results that happened in California happened in Michigan. So affirmative action is standing in the way of graduation, and it's standing in the way of effective solutions for the problem of, K through 12 and any obstacles that kind of arise before getting to college.
Right. So, you brought up, that whole statistic of, the students going into those, STEM fields. And, honestly, you're 100% right. They aren't necessarily going into the right fields, and, they're being, put into places where it's very difficult for them to succeed. But as you said, they do switch out. And, I've never advocated that, affirmative action necessarily, works 100% of the time, or, it's the perfect solution. But the fact of the matter is, more minority students are getting into college with affirmative action. It's just a fact. And when you look at those states with bans on affirmative action, less minorities are getting into these schools. So whether or not, they're being put into the right, system or not, whether they're being put into the right, college or, field of study is, besides the point, because, they can't even, switch their major if they're not getting into college in the first place. And, the whole goal of this is to get minorities into college so that they have that educational opportunity. And, yes, these graduation rates, are very important. And, that is how we mainly, judge this, educational standard. But we also have to realize that this educational standard, isn't necessarily the same for everyone. Yes, we're looking at, educational standard for, college, from a college standpoint, the graduation rate is very, very important. But, for a lot of, these minorities, getting into college and just getting that, opportunity, whether or not they drop out, is, a success for them. And in a world where having a college degree or college experience is essentially vital for, getting a job or getting, a good job, getting these kids into college is, the best thing that we can do for them at this point. And, the K through 12 education system is a mess and it needs to be fixed. But, you can't fix it on a college level. You have to fix it on a high school level. And, that's not what we're debating today. What we're debating is whether or not, affirmative action should stay within colleges and universities. And the fact of the matter is it has to stay in place until, that K through 12 education system is fixed, because we just have to get these kids to college to begin with. Whether or not, they graduate or are successful in college, that's, further down the line, and that's something we can address at a later point. But we have to keep them, we just have to get them in the door. We have to give them that opportunity to have that academic success that, non-minorities have, because they deserve just as much of a chance to succeed as everybody else.
Okay, so real quick, I want to address the kind of, you said that the goal of affirmative action is to get minorities into college. And I just want to bring this back to kind of my initial setup of the debate, which is just that the ultimate goal of affirmative action is bridging the gap of education attainment for minorities. It's not to get them into college. Like, yes, obviously we need them to get into college if we want them to graduate and get an education, but the ultimate goal is to bridge the gap. And you kind of said this yourself, right? College experience is vital for, going into the workforce. Employers don't look at your college experience in terms of, oh, great, you did 3 semesters in university and then dropped out. No, it's whether or not you graduated, whether or not you have a degree, whether or not you mastered the program that you were in. That's how people evaluate your education attainment. And so, yes, it's true. It's absolutely true that affirmative action gets more minority numbers into college. Yes, I'll concede to that, but that's not the point of affirmative action. That's not the goal. It's not enough to just get them into college. The whole point is for them to have an education and to bridge that gap to close that gap of education attainment. And even if we're having this conversation of let's keep it until the K through 12 problem is fixed, I've already kind of proved in this debate that affirmative action stands in the way of that. It stands in the way of focus on the real problems, on outreach for the issues or the areas that need it most. And again, California and Michigan are both examples of where this is absolutely true, and the numbers have proved to improve, and the numbers support the goal of affirmative action when affirmative action is banned. So that clearly shows that if we're evaluating this debate on whether or not affirmative action works, then we see that it doesn't do what it aims to do. It doesn't close that education gap. So in principle, again, like I'm saying, we shouldn't have it. We shouldn't have a system in place that doesn't do what it's supposed to do, what it aims to do. And again, ineffective and borderline counterproductive with representation, right? There's less representation now than there was 35 years ago. And it's counterproductive to graduation and effective solutions. So again, I think a lot of these facts have been conceded, like the fact that it worsens graduation and that it worsens the effective solutions. So at that point, I think that pro I'm winning in this debate. So vote pro, 5 seconds.
All right, so just to finish this whole debate up, first I'd like to address this educational standard kind of you say that the goal of affirmative action is to bridge this education gap, and I would agree, and the thing is, yes, graduation rates are higher in California and Michigan for minorities. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's bridging the educational gap. There's less minorities in these colleges to begin with. That doesn't mean we're bridging that gap. It just means that there's less people who are more successful. I would rather have more minorities be somewhat successful than have a small amount be majorly successful, because we're not trying to impact, a small amount of minorities. We're trying to bridge this gap and, get as many of them into, this college door as possible, to give them that opportunity. Because the fact of the matter is they are underrepresented in, from, 79 to 82%, of schools. They're underrepresented, in the majority of these states and in these schools. And, you look at the states who have bans on affirmative action, and, students, it is significantly harder for minorities to get into college in these states that have bans on affirmative action. And, yes, the goal of affirmative action is to bridge that educational gap, but we cannot bridge that educational gap when, less and less minorities are able to get into the school to begin with. Because you could have some kid who, had, a 3.2 GPA, scored, 25 on the ACT, whatever. And that kid could be, one of the most successful people out there, but he's not going to get into one of those colleges because he's not, quote unquote, the best, candidate to get into those type of schools. The goal of affirmative action is to bridge that educational gap. We cannot bridge that educational gap if less and less minorities are able to get into college to begin with. Because yes, college is about getting the best and the brightest, but this isn't a job. This isn't something where it is vitally successful for someone to be 100% perfect, at whatever it is. We're not looking for the best total candidates. We're looking for people who want to learn, the people who this would benefit the most. And these minorities, they want to go to college, they want to learn, they want to have this opportunity. And that's the goal of affirmative action, to let them in, to give them that opportunity, not to have, less of them graduate more. It's to have more of them just get in the door.
Okay. If we're trying to close the gap or bridge the gap, the education gap, you're saying that you can't close the gap if we don't have minority students in college. True, but we also can't close the gap with minority students in college and affirmative action because I've showed in my debate that doesn't work. So we need to solve the root problem, which affirmative action stands in the way of.
And I mean, there's not really much else for me to say in 5 seconds. Thank you.